Yeah, I started writing Epsilon Theory because I was in a pretty dark place, right? Because I saw all the stories and the narratives, and it seemed to be pretty hopeless. But it's precisely in writing it and finding that there are hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who, like you, Conor, are truth seekers. And we're just trying to figure this shit out, right? And so long as we can find each other, then I've got all the hope in the world, because this is how the world changes. It always changes from the bottom up, not from the top down. The world really changes from the bottom up.
Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Conor Devine and you're watching Money and Plants. This is episode number 49 of the podcast, and in this conversation I'm going to be speaking to the wonderful Ben Hunt. Who is Ben Hunt? Well, for me anyway, I think Ben Hunt is one of the most interesting critical thinkers right now in the United States. He is also a PhD. He's got a PhD in political science from Harvard University. He has managed his own hedge fund, his own billion-dollar hedge fund. He has also co-founded multiple tech companies. He's been investing for 40 years. He's been studying human behavior for 40 odd years. But over the last 10 years, he has probably left the conventional professional world, and he has started this blog, this website, this database called Epsilon Theory. And for anybody who's interested in business, trying to figure out human behavior, trying to figure out why people do the things that they do, then Epsilon Theory is a resource that you have to check out. It's an amazing piece of work. It's an amazing research. And Ben is, I would say, easily one of the most fascinating thinkers that I have ever had in the podcast, and probably that I've ever spoken to. An incredibly articulate individual. He seems to understand lots of things and is able to break it down into layman's terms so people like you and me can understand it. We have a wonderful conversation around human behavior, around big tech, the impact of big pharma, of big politics, of what is happening right now in the world, how that influences our own thoughts, which then influences how we behave and how we react to big world events. It was a really big conversation. I didn't expect it to be as big as it was, but how about I roll the tape and then I'll do a sum up, which I always do at the end of every podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation between myself and Ben Hunt in Connecticut earlier this week on Money and Plants. So Ben Hunt, you're really welcome to my podcast, Money and Plants. It's fantastic to speak to you. I've been following your work only for 3 or 4 months, so please forgive me. You have been writing Epsilon Theory for, I believe, since 2013. So I would love you to give me a brief introduction just to yourself, because obviously I'm in Ireland.
Sure, Conor.
In Connecticut.
No, so thanks for having me on. Happy to be here. No, I've done a lot of different things. As my wife likes to say, I have a hard time keeping a job. I was a professor, an academic, a professor of political science, of all oxymorons, for 10 years. So I was a tenured professor. But I suspect, like a lot of your listeners, I always had the entrepreneurial bug. And so I left academia to start a software company. And then I sold the software company and got into the world of investing from there, and started a hedge fund, and worked in a number of places. But it was really in 2013, like I say, about 10 years ago, or coming up on 10 years, that I started writing what I call Epsilon Theory. And it's an examination of, call it narrative, right? And the way that impacts politics and markets. What we mean by narrative, though, is the common thread that's gone through at least my professional career of academia and software company and then investing. And that's looking at what we call unstructured data. So it's the words that we read, it's the speeches that we listen to, it's the things we hear on television, it's what we read on our iPhones and smartphones. It's all of these messages that we are inundated with morning, noon, and night. And the gist of what I write about and how I invest in the software company and academic research is that we human beings, we are quite literally hardwired, meaning that our brains are evolved and we have neural clusters that respond to language. And not just language generally speaking, but linguistic patterns, stories, scripts, plots that have a beginning and a middle and an end. And once you start looking for that, first of all, you'll see it everywhere. But the point of the research and the writing that we do is that once you start looking for it, once you start recognizing it, you can become a better investor, a better citizen, a better partner and parent and child, a better human being by recognizing how we are surrounded by these messages, these story arcs, these scripts, and how people try to use them intentionally to alter our behavior. And so being able to create that sort of critical distance to recognize when you're being played, it just helps us become better people. So that's the long-winded introduction, but that's what I do, and that's why I'm so happy to be on your podcast.
Yeah, and so you've been writing in Epsilon Theory for about 10 years, and it's a blog, it's a website. You've over 100,000 subscribers, and it's an amazing resource for anybody that's interested in human behavior. And it's really, whenever I've had lots of different economists and business people, and I've even had a finance minister on my show, but for me, economics is the study of human behavior, right? So, as an entrepreneur and a thinker myself, I think if you can figure out humans, and I think humans are hugely complex species, I think we're very problematic. But if you can understand human behavior, then you've got the bones of a business, right? So you can come up with solutions that might lend themselves to solving all these problems that's out there. But so do you think you would have been fit to start Epsilon Theory in your 20s? Or did you have to go through 4 decades, nearly get to the 5th decade, where you had enough experience, life experience, business experience, political experience, social experience to say, do you know what, I'm going to start writing about this stuff because I now understand human behavior, or I'm getting there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, there's this famous, it's a story that was told by David Foster Wallace, famous novelist. He was giving this address at a commencement, a graduation address at a U.S. college. And the story he liked to tell was that there are these 2 young fish, they're swimming along, and an old fish comes by the other direction. And the old fish says to the 2 young fish, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish look at the old fish and go, yeah, whatever, Gramps, it's fine, yeah, whatever. And they swim on. And then one of the young fish looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" Right? So this is the way I feel about narratives, the story arcs, the scripts that we are immersed in. I say morning, noon, and night, day after day, every day of our lives. It's the water in which we swim. And it's difficult to see the water, especially when you're younger. Somebody will tell you a story. A politician will tell you a story. A CEO will tell you a story. You'll read something in the newspaper and you'll go, "Huh, that's interesting." And again, it's because we literally can't help it. It's what it means to be a social animal, is that we respond to stories. And so, yeah, it takes practice. It takes practice, and it takes both an inquisitiveness, an effort to kind of look for the truth. But I think that most of us have that in us, right? And it does take, I think, often some experiences for when you're told a story and then you realize, because it ends up hurting you, oh, that was just a story. It does take some experiences like that, I think, for anyone to start seeing the water. But the reason I write, and the reason I try to talk about the role of story arcs and scripts and narratives in our politics and in our investing lives, is to help people see the water. That's it exactly.
So just on that very point, and I've been excited about this next question for you for a while, right? Because as humans, we all have our own, we support our own sort of sports teams. We support our own political parties. I live in Ireland. I live in the north of Ireland, but I'm Irish. I'm very much into the opportunity of an all-island economy, of Irish reunification, what that can do, because I believe that kids in the north should have the same economic opportunities as kids in the south. So you may not be up to speed, but there's this big Irish reunification, Scottish reunification. We had German reunification, all of that. So, but I'm really interested in how you deal then with your own internal bias, right? How do you, whenever you're writing, because we're all biased, right? And this is something I've been pushing back against myself over the last 2 years, but particularly as we've maybe got a bit more profile about me. My podcast is doing well, and I'm starting to talk about important things. So how do you push back yourself, or do you just not push back? Because I do hear you talking about this a lot.
No, Conor, you've already reached, I'll call it the second level of thinking about narratives and story arcs. And what I mean by that is I always start these conversations, and people are often quite receptive to the idea that, oh, it's the water in which we swim. Other people are telling us stories. But the truth of the matter is, Conor, you put your finger on it. The most impactful stories are the stories we tell ourselves. Because all of us live our lives as if we are the protagonist in a story. And we make sense of our own lives through these story arcs. Now, everyone wants to be, and you should be, the hero of your own story, the protagonist of your own story. So you're totally right that the most impactful stories are the stories we tell ourselves. And what that requires is that the same, I'll say, critical distance, not criticizing, but I'm saying a critical distance that we apply to others, in this, like a politician or a central banker or a CEO. We apply, I think it's really important to apply a critical distance. Don't take what they say into your heart, no matter how compelling the story is. We have to apply that same critical distance to ourselves. And that's the hardest thing in the world. Right? So to my mind, there are two just forever and eternal truths about human behavior. And one, they were both talked about, they've been talked about for thousands of years, but they're most associated with two people. The first really important thing is, frankly, is most associated with Jesus, right? Which is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule, the rule of empathy, which is just this core thing for guiding a good life. The other was really put out by Socrates, where he said, know thyself. And so when I talk about maintaining that critical distance and thinking about the stories that we tell ourselves, it all goes back to freaking Socrates, right? Know thyself. And I think there are some specific practices or actions we can all take to try to know ourselves better, to maintain that critical distance. And the one that I really recommend to people is that when you read a story and you think about how it's impacting you, oh my God, I can't believe, they're doing this in politics, or oh my God, I can't believe the other team is doing this, in sports or marketing, whatever it is, right? Just step back for a second and ask yourself, why am I reading this now? The answer might be, because, some big event just happened. So it's a story about that. But more often than not, what I find in this world is that stories are published in order to elicit a specific reaction from you, in order to tap into one of these stories that we tell ourselves. And it doesn't mean you have to reject the story that you read. It doesn't mean you have to, in the US, investing, we say, fight the Fed. You don't have to fight it. But it's so important that you recognize that there is a story arc here, and that the words and the phrases and the framing of a story and the framing of quote unquote news is intentionally arranged to make it compelling to you, to make you engage with it. And it makes you engage with it to the degree that it fits or clicks or is in opposition to the story you tell yourself. So it's all part and parcel. I'm really glad you brought that up, Conor, because again, the important thing is not just to focus on the stories that others tell us, but also to think critically about the stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah, it's quite deep, and I think you can only understand that if you're either prepared to do the work on yourself and ask those deep questions of yourself. And normally you have to get to a period in your life, often whenever you're challenged with things, that you have to do that body of work. For me personally, it happened through a health situation with myself, where this last 15 years I've been actually in this health sort of journey of transformation, where I had to actually find out it's really an identity issue.
Absolutely.
It's actually something I spoke to an amazing doctor, Jeffrey Rediger. He's actually from your neck of the woods. He's written an amazing book called Cured, C-U-R-E-D, about patients that he's studied over the last 20 years that have went on to experience spontaneous healing from often diagnosis of cancer and all of that. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the 4 pillars, one being the pillar of identity. It's to try and understand yourself. And I think it speaks, we're talking about this now. I wanted to talk to you about central banks and economics, but ultimately it comes back to you. Often what I say, Ben, myself is over the last 20 years at home, I'm Clark Kent. But mm-hmm. when I leave the front door, I'm Superman. I change into this person and I'm going out and I'm trying to sell money or real estate or whatever it is. And I think all of us are like that. At home where you're Ben, at home with your family. But whenever you go into the hedge fund world, you're a different person. I'm interested in this one then. So whenever you were running your own hedge fund, the environment that you have now, I'm not sure how you operate with Epsilon Theory. Maybe you work on your own or you have others. But do you think we are all products of our environment? So the environment that you're in, sort of since you left, say, the hedge fund world, is probably very different to that world. And do you think that environment has shaped your thoughts then, as you write today about SBF and FTX and everything that happens? So, do you think, I think the answer to this, I know what you might say, but that environment that we keep is very important in terms of how we perform then, would you suggest, and how we behave and react to things?
So there's so much to unpack there, Conor, right? So the hedge fund, we run a hedge fund today, but it's a systematic hedge fund. Whereas the hedge fund that I ran before was discretionary. And here's the difference. With a discretionary hedge fund where you have to, think every day you're thinking, where am I right? Where am I wrong? What you realize really quickly when you're running a discretionary fund is that you're wrong about something every day. Mm-hmm. It's a simple truth. You're wrong about something every day. And the question is, what do you do about it? So it requires you to wrestle with the recognition that you were wrong And I find that that's actually in, I'll say limited doses, right? A very healthy regimen for dealing with the world, to recognize that you're wrong about something every day. The difficulty, though, with running a kind of managing the personal and the professional with running a discretionary hedge fund is that it ages you in dog years, right? Being wrong about something every day is something that's very unpleasant, again, to the story that we tell ourselves. And it's creating that sort of balance without going over to the extreme of creating these internal walls and barriers, becoming a sociopath in the clinical sense of the word, where you compartmentalize everything. That's a very common reaction to being wrong about something every day, is you compartmentalize it and you say, no, that's someone else. And you start wearing these sort of masks, the Superman outfit like you're describing. And what I think happens to a lot of people, and you could feel that happening to yourself, is you start to lose yourself and you start to forget what's the mask and what's the authentic human being underneath. And where that particularly plays out, I think, is that you start to lose the ability to connect with the people who are most important to you.
Yeah.
Your partner, your children, your family, the like. And I'll say for me personally, a decision, I'm never going to go back to that sort of world, because if you're going to take that seriously, if you're going to take managing other people's money seriously in a discretionary form where you have that responsibility, you've got to wrestle with the fact that you're going to be wrong about something every day. Your focus and your authentic being has to be on doing well by the other people who have entrusted you their money. And it's very damaging, or can be very damaging, I think, to your sense of identity over any kind of longer period of time. So again, another long-winded answer, but to a very important question. So the way I try to balance that today is we're a registered investment advisor, but we do it in a systematic form where I don't have to wake up every morning saying, oh, should I do X or should I do Y? Right? We have our process, and that's what we do. What it also frees me up to do, though, is to write authentically without pulling any punches, without writing to use my words to achieve some effect or a portfolio. What I write is totally separate from anything we do in the investing world. And so doing those two things, taking out the discretionary part, where to be legitimate and authentic about it, you have to take it on as your identity, and being able to be able to write so I can speak my authentic mind. I think those two things are really important. Last thing, Conor, and this, because I think you'll recognize this because you do a podcast. We all have something to say, right? We've all got something to say. And finding that ability to speak and to use your voice, whether it's by creating a podcast, whether it's like I do, write notes and blog and the like, I think that is so important in developing your own identity and, being true to being a truth seeker. Yeah. So anyway, again, long-winded answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, but I think if one of the reasons why I wanted to create my own business, and I suppose I was working in the real estate markets for 20 years for bigger companies, and often you can't really express yourself in those institutions and those companies. You can't really be yourself. And I think whenever you do something yourself and you create your own business, you get that, it's like freedom, and you can express yourself. You've got your own identity. You can say, write what you want. Nobody can really tell you what to do within limits, and it's so empowering. But look, we've went on far longer than I thought, talking about really important stuff, right?
Absolutely.
And I never got to speak to you about any of the really boring things, right? But there's a couple of things.
Wait a minute. We'll talk about it a little bit. Go ahead. Let's do a little boring stuff. Yeah.
Right. So look, I've got friendly with Nick Leeson over the years. Nick's done some
Yeah,
work for me actually, and he's the original rogue trader. Fascinating,
absolutely.
fascinating tale. And we're quite friendly. And he comes on the pod now and again. And Nick's a pretty pessimistic, sort of down kind of guy. Everything's kind of it's quite
Yeah.
gloomy. He's actually better fun when you're out with him and you meet him really. But anyway, I was talking to him last week and he caught me in the hop a little bit, right? Because I mentioned to you before, but I'm an agent for the Bank of England. What does that mean? It means that I'm one of 90 agents in Northern Ireland. There's 600 across the UK. And they update us. They come and speak to us every now and again to say, look, what's happening? How's the property market going? What are people feeling? What are they thinking? Jobs, investment, FDI, all of that sort of stuff. And then they feed back into the Monetary Policy Committee. And they probably do a similar exercise in the US. Yep. And yep. It was interesting for me, Ben, because I never thought, that was important, the bank trying to figure out what's going on out there. So it's a really good resource for them to tap into, probably, people like me. Anyway, Nick caught me in the hop a little bit because most people that I've been speaking to of late are quite pessimistic about the next 2 years. At that Bank of England conference last week, the presentation, there was 40 of us in the room. They were really down in the mouth, 2-year recession, quite gloomy, interest rates in GB going to about 6%, and then they drop off. They were totally obsessed with getting inflation down to 2%, not 4%, 2%, right? Mm-hmm. And it was interesting, Ben, the slide they showed, by not putting interest rates up to 6, maybe even to 5, so taking a bit of the heat out of it, gets you to an inflation rate of about 4%, but they're prepared to take on the extra damage in the economy to get it to 2, even though you and I probably understand that nobody knows if it'll go to 2 or not, but still that's their focus, right? Yep. So anyway, Nick wasn't as pessimistic about the US economy, right? He actually thought that the US is going for a bit of a soft landing. He thinks earnings is still really good in the US. He was more pessimistic about the UK and the EU, okay, over the next 2 years. But that kind of surprised me because whenever you listen to who I think is an independent thinker in Q Henry and others who don't seem to be biased, they're seeing dead people and seeing destruction and, it's quite theatrical. So I'm interested in your sober sort of view of things, if there is such a general view on where the US economy might be going as opposed to the UK and the EU.
So, the first thing I'll say is that I find so much of how we perceive the world is based on how we're wired as investors. So I will tell you, I'm wired as a short seller. My, hedge fund, that was what I primarily focused on was I am wired to find problems in companies, right? Other investors, right, are wired very differently. They're wired to find, here's an opportunity. Here's how they're going to succeed and grow. And for me, I don't know why this is, but I'm just wired to look for the faults and then why something's going to fail.
Okay.
I at the same time though, I share what I think you're going with this, and I bet Nick is similarly wired like I am, and so that's why it kind of is in high information value when a person who's wired to be negative says something positive or relatively positive. I agree with Nick that I'm relatively positive on the US, and I think that what can derail this positive outlook I have for the US is if we have continued or accelerated political polarization going into the 2024 election. Mm-hmm. That's my concern, because I think there's a very deep and abiding well of severe polarization between left and right here in the US, really severe. And I think it's underestimated how severe the distance is between left and right with a European audience. So that would be my caveat, as they'd say, right, to
Mm.
a relatively upbeat. Again, relatively, right? I mean, God knows the U.S. is at the same issues of
Sure.
reversal in globalization and inflation and all these things. But there is still in the United States, I find, a positive energy of entrepreneurialism and rebirth, right? And looking for opportunity that I don't know any other. And I travel a lot. I don't know any other country that has that. I think there's a bit of that in Ireland, frankly, right? I really do. But it's particularly pronounced, I think, here in the United States still. After all that every Western country has gone through. So I'd kind of shared Nick's view that I am also wired to be a short seller and be pessimistic, but relatively speaking, I think there's no better place than the United States, with the caveat of I am still quite concerned about the political polarization going into 2020.
Okay, so excellent, really interesting stuff. I was out walking yesterday there's a mountain behind me with a friend of mine. He's actually a human rights lawyer, and we were talking about the last 3 years of COVID. From a mental health perspective, everybody thought they were going to die, and then we figured out, well, most people didn't die. And I was hoping for a bit of a mental health boost coming out of that period, because it was quite dark for people to live through for different reasons. But then we've went into this, everybody's going to go bust. We're not going to be able to afford this cost of living, cost of doing business crisis. And it actually, the feeling over here where I am in this part of the world, it's quite difficult. People are really struggling to deal with this onslaught from big media, big pharma, big tech. It's just boom, boom. It's just onslaught, and there's no sense then of it stopping. Okay, negativity. And for me personally, I've had to try and take a step back over the last 6 months to try and figure out, how am I going to react to this?
Yep.
Right. So, because I can only control the controllables. I can't change people's behavior. I can't change the media. So how am I going? So I've undertaken that body of work, and it's been brilliant for my mental health, for my mindset, and for work, my own goals and aspirations in life. But I was sharing with this other guy who's sort of still there. The point I was making to him, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. So one of the best books and most fascinating books I've read is Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. I read that about 2 years ago. It took me about 9 months to read it. You probably know the book. It's so thick. It's a really tough read, but it's amazing, right? And then about 2 weeks ago, I watched on BBC iPlayer, and again, if you can pick this up, The Rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, where Hitler was the Nazis came in sort of 1931 and 1940. Yep. The point I'm making, and then we had the 70s, which was really problematic. We had 2 world wars in between, but then we've had the pandemic. And my point is that, and you've just made a point about you're concerned about the political polarization in the States. And I follow Megyn Kelly's podcast. I listen to the politics that's going on in the States. I see how fragmented it is. But my observation, Ben, would be that there has always been unrest. There has always been wars. There has always been trouble. And I'm interested in your response to this is, do you think it's any worse? I know what's going on with Ukraine and with China and Taiwan and all of that, and I know you're concerned about that. But my sense is that there's always been turbulence. It's always been really bad. There's always been evil, right?
Yeah.
In that context, how do you contextualize where we are today, you in Connecticut, me in Belfast?
Yeah. Here's the difference between today and any point in the past. And it's what you described earlier: big media, big tech, big politics. Those are the three-headed monster that I see.
Yeah.
And
Cerberus.
Exactly. And the reason they have, I believe, such an undue influence today is similarly 3 developments that have happened in the world. Right? The first is primarily a media development, and that's the development of 24/7, always on, quote unquote, news channels.
Yeah.
I say quote unquote because, there's not enough news to fill up, 30 minutes, much less 24 hours. So what all these shows do, and these are the the political 24-hour shows, it's also the market 24-hour shows,
Yeah.
is that they bring on people who present an opinion as news. Right? So we have 24/7 people providing opinions designed to get us to respond. Again, it's the messages, the story arcs that are
Marketing
told to us, right? And the goal here is to drive engagement. The goal is not to make us like what they're saying. The goal is to make us engage and react with a powerful emotion to what they're saying. That's development number one. Development number two is that really with the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the aftermath of that was for central banks, for all politicians to use their words intentionally to try to change our behaviors.
Yeah.
Right? It's something that, like you say, politicians have known this thousands of years. But now everybody does it. Every CEO is trying to create a narrative about their company. Every central banker is trying to create a narrative about why this is good or this is bad. Everyone is in on the act. Right? That's two. And third, and maybe the most important, and I don't know, there's going to be a video, there's probably just a recording, but right now I'm holding up for the camera my iPhone. I like to call it my dopamine machine because I look at this all the time. It's the last thing I look at when I go to sleep at night. It's the first thing I look at when I wake up in the morning. Not my wife, this little machine. And how sad is that? But everyone, I think, to one degree or another now, is that we have allowed these machines into our lives so that we are constantly, and to a degree that's never existed before in human history, we are allowing these messages, these narratives to wash over us all the time, every day, at every hour of the day. I'm allowing these messages to come wash over me. That's what's different, Conor. That's what's different. It's not, you're absolutely right about the events and human nature, all that's constant. What is different today is the structure of media around 24/7, the structure of effective economic and political behavior, which is to tell a story. But most importantly, it's the growth of social media and the devices to spread it.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Okay. Yeah, I accept that. I want to finish on two things. We have been on this sort of free money sort of curve for the last 20 odd years. Interest rates have went to naught, and it's fascinating. I've learned a lot listening to some of your contributions around that. But I'm interested in, interest rates are starting to sort of move up to 6% here in the UK. Politically, it's more challenging in Europe to raise interest rates because it's so split in every way. Actually, the mood music in Europe, living in this, it's not great. It's a hard project to hold together. But do you see interest rates generally sort of easing off in the States, in the UK around 6%ish? If my layman's sort of outlook on this was if they go to 10%, everybody goes bust, we pack up and go home, So just interested, do you think the Fed won't go much harder on interest rates? Do you think that'll settle down and around where it's at now, or how do you see that repricing of money moving forward in the next 3 years?
So I believe strongly, right, that in exactly the same way that lowering interest rates to zero did not achieve what central bankers hoped to achieve, which was inflation. They were trying to spur inflation. Similarly, raising interest rates from 0% to, say, 4%, that doesn't do anything to control inflation. It's only when you start getting I'll call it my rough number is 4%. Once you start getting over 4%, the interest rate increases actually start to gear into the real economy.
Yeah.
They're hoping they can stop it in the US, they can stop it around 5%, that they can put on enough brakes at 5% to start bringing it slowly back down to their target. I'm not so sure they can, right? My personal view is you raise interest rates to 5.5% here in the United States. We can get inflation down to 5%, right? But you can't get it down to 2%, which is what they want to do. I think that to get it down there, you've got to crush everyone's psychology. And to crush that psychology, you've got to have basically another Great Recession. You've got to destroy home prices, the way you did in 2008. And that is the big question, right? Do they say that they're willing to do that, but are they willing? Are they really? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think that's what we're going to find out, Conor. I think that the interest rates today can get inflation down to, call it, that 5% level. But do you stop there, or do you go and say, no, we're going to get it back down to 2%? Because to do that, I think you've got to squeeze a lot harder.
The complexity in all of what you're talking about there, and for me, this is something that I've started to only really understand in the last 18 months, is everything comes back to politics. So, whenever I was at the Bank of England presentation last week, I've sort of, who came up with this 2%? I never understood who came up with. Did they just go, well, what about 2%? That sounds like a good inflation target. Let's keep that as a global rate. But then the economist beside me gave me a decent enough answer, which made sense to me here in the UK, was that, inflation's at 2%, because if it's running at 5%, then people in the NHS and, the civil service will want pay increases in line with. So it comes back to politics. So as low as we possibly can keep it, then we can keep everyone in that sort of pay scale. So the penny started to drop with me on that front, that it's pay related. So ultimately it's political. So do you think, because you're sort of Biden's 2 years into this campaign, it's politically challenging now in the States with everything that's going on, that's a real driver in this interest rate discussion? And how much autonomy really does the Fed have then, if any, Ben?
Well, I think they've got a good bit of autonomy, because as politically damaging as a recession and losing a job is, the constant damage of, oh my God, I can't afford to go eat out anymore. I can't afford to, send my kids to college. I mean, that's even more politically damaging. Yeah. So it's, this is, we have to pay the piper. And we've had 40 years of not having to worry about this, not having these trade-offs, and those days are over. So, you have to play the cards you're dealt. These are the cards that have been dealt. We have to deal with the world as it is. This is the way it is. We're not going back to the world before. And we have to chart the world going forward, being as authentic and true to ourselves, seeing the stories that we're telling ourselves and that others are telling us. That's the best we can do. So let's do it.
Okay, final one then. So could you leave me with some hope? I've heard you speak about this, about the importance of finding your community and your tribe and your pack.
Yeah.
And
I started writing Epsilon Theory because I was in a pretty dark place, right? Because I saw all the stories and the narratives, and it seemed to be pretty hopeless. But it's precisely in writing it and finding that there are hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who, like you, Conor, are truth seekers. And we're just trying to figure this shit out, right? And so long as we can find each other, then I've got all the hope in the world, because this is how the world changes. It always changes from the bottom up, not from the top down. The world really changes from the bottom up. And I get an enormous amount of optimism from having conversations like this, Conor. That's what does it for me.
Amazing. So look, I just want to thank you, Ben, for
my pleasure.
Everything that you've done. It's been amazing to speak to you. And I'm looking forward to getting stuck into Epsilon Theory over the weeks and months ahead. So Ben Hunt, thank you very much. Take care of yourself.
Thank you, Conor. Appreciate it. Take care.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the summary of episode number 49. that was a really deep, big conversation that I had with Ben Hunt, but I really enjoyed it. I would really encourage you, if you're interested in politics, in business, in understanding human behavior, understanding some of the big events that's going on in the world right now, to check out Epsilon Theory. Ben's website, find him on Twitter. He's twittering often. His views and perspective on things is, I just think it's really, really helpful how he thinks about things. And I think as a resource, I think he is an amazing resource for certainly people like me personally, to try and figure out some of what's happening, how all of this stuff is impacting our lives. Some really interesting stuff there around, in terms of Ben's view on the US economy. He is certainly a bit more optimistic than many of the other people I've been speaking to. He does share Nick Leeson's view that they might be in for a kind of a soft landing. However, he did caveat that around the concern he does have for politics and how fragmented politics is in the US right now. And I've been following the US politics situation now for 5 or 6 years. And with Biden entering the last 2 years of his presidency, things are getting really hot, with Trump obviously nominating to run, and Ron DeSantis, who will probably run against him for the Republican nomination. I think that's going to get really nasty. And it's interesting, and it is really important actually, who ends up winning that Republican nomination and who ultimately ends up being the president of the United States in only 24 months' time, because the US, whether you like it or you don't like it, does set the tone for global politics, and often the economic outcomes that can happen then in the subsequent 4 to 6 years after the president is named, given depending upon certain economic policies that current president might implement. So it's an important time for the world whenever the US sort of president campaign comes up. And I thought Ben's take on that was really, really interesting. I thought it was interesting whenever he talked about the central banks and the fact that the Fed are trying to crush inflation. He does think that the Fed might continue to increase rates in the United States. I thought that was really interesting. And then to finally finish off in the conversation on a positive note, the importance of finding your tribe, finding your community, finding your voice, actually. And the importance, something that I talk about a lot of, integrity, being true to yourself. Ben called me a truth seeker. I'm happy with that. That's fine. I've always been someone who's curious, who's trying to figure out things and be honest with people, speak your mind. I thought that was really interesting, and I was glad to hear Ben endorse that pathway in life. So if you're listening to this podcast and you are an independent thinker and you have a passion for something and you believe in something and you do have integrity as an integral part to your very existence, then I would encourage you to stick with that and to go and find your own path, find your own tribe, find your own community. And certainly that's something that I've been doing for the last few years on Instagram, where I'm so passionate about health, about sharing my own journey of healing and health, and how that might be able to help other people who are struggling with any kind of disease or challenge or problem in their own life. So that was great endorsement for me. It was brilliant to hear Ben endorsing that pathway. So find your tribe, find your pack, and try and stay optimistic, which was really powerful result, a really powerful way to end that conversation with Ben Hunt. So look, that's been episode number 49. You're listening to Money and Plants. If you like the show, please leave me a review and share it with a friend. You can reach me at conor@conordivine.com. I would love to hear your feedback on the show. I'd love to hear your feedback on Ben, his thoughts on how the world is going right now. So until next time, look after yourself and each other.